Hi everyone, this is Hussein, and in today's session we will use Docker Compose to run our product store application. Let's take a quick look at the agenda for today. We will explain what is Docker Compose and why we might need it. Then we will jump into code to check Docker Compose file of our application, see how we can seed an existing running database with data, and run some Docker Compose commands. For the prerequisites, we don't need additional tools. We just need Git, Visual Studio Code, and Docker. That's what we have used in the previous session. So in the session before, we saw how we containerize our product store application. We created a Docker file for each of those services: the UI, the ASP.NET API, and the Mongo database. Then we built the images, created a network, and ran the containers so they can communicate together. Actually, it was not a big deal to run the application using Docker commands. However, what if you have more containers? It will be actually an inefficient and unproductive process to run the whole application manually ourselves. So how we would overcome this issue? Docker Compose makes it simpler and avoids us writing tons of commands with Docker CLI to run a microservice application. So Docker Compose is a tool that allows us to define the services that make up our application and start up multiple containers at the same time, expose the ports, and automatically connect them together with some form of networking. With Compose, we can use a YAML file to configure our application services, which are the containers. Then with a single command, which is Docker Compose app, we will create and start all the services. And once we are done, we can describe them all together using another command, which is Docker Compose down. In our case, we need a YAML file, as I said, and the YAML file, we need like 3 services. Here we have our UI, a service for the UI application, a service for the RESTful service, and another service for the Mongo database. Now, let's see Docker Compose in action. I'm jumping to my code here. This is my Visual Studio code. This is my application. And here I have created a Docker Compose file in my application directory. So, and in this file, you can see it's more readable and we can easily understand what our application is made up of. So first, I'm specifying the version of Compose. Then I start listing my services: a service for the Mongo database container, a service for the backend API, and a service for the front-end application. So Docker Compose needs an image to run our service containers, right? So it can be an existing image, such as in situation here where we're pointing to a Mongo with this tag 3.6.1, and this image can be existing in Docker Hub, right? Because it's a public repository. So Docker Compose will check that on Docker Hub, or before that, it even will check that locally. If it's not existing, it will check Docker Compose Hub and pull that image. Or the other way is build our own image. In this situation, we have to specify the directory where the Docker file resides or exists. So there's no sophisticated stuff here. We have our image, we're specifying the container name, and then we're specifying the port, the host port and the container port. The same stuff for the backend API. I'm calling the image products API, the same for my container name, and specifying the directory where the Docker file exists. In the situation backend here, this is a Docker file. Specifying the ports. The same stuff for the front-end application. I'm specifying different directory in the situation and different ports. If you see here, depends on actually starts the service in dependency order. So here it would start the DB first, since the backend API depends on the Mongo database, and then after that it will start the backend API, since the front end depends on the backend API container. If you noticed here, I have used different names for my containers. So the container name for MongoDB is mongo-db, and the container name for the backend API is products API. This is kind of different from what I've used in order to run my application manually, where you see here I'm calling my database container DB, and I pass the environment variable for my database to the API as database here as DB. So in going back to the Docker file, Docker compose file, environment variables I'm using here in order to customize, maybe I'll use different names for database container, database server, whatever what is your case. So in this situation, I have to pass my database container here, which is this one. I'm passing it. I'm also passing the database name. Those environment variable will be injected to my application where I'm specifying that in the backend application and app settings. If you see here, this is a product store database settings, and this is a product collection name, and this is a connection string, right? So going back to Docker compose file, you see an environment variable. We talk about every specific tag or attribute here, and now it's time to run our application, right? So as we said, we need to run Docker compose app. I can run it from the terminal, or I can run it from here. I'm using here the Docker compose extension, so it provided me with this kind of options here. So in one command now, Docker compose app, if you see that now I'm Docker compose is running, specifying the Docker compose file and up in order to build the images, and then run the whole application, run each container, and create a network and attach those containers to that network so they can communicate together. Now it built the backend API container. It's building the front end applications, the UI. So let's see successfully like built and tagged the UI, creating the MongoDB, the products API, and the UI. If we now want to list our containers, we can see actually that these 3 containers are up and running. Now let's browse our application. So the UI is running on port 8080 and the backend is running on port 5001. So this is our UI. We need to click get products to call the backend application to get the data. And if you see here, we're not getting any data. So let's test the API here. No data. And this is because we didn't populate our database container, our Mongo database. In the previous session, we show how we can populate our Mongo database container by going into it and executing some certain commands. If you need to check it out. Check out my previous session, and this is the Docker file for that DB container, and those are the files that I need. For this one, I've created something which another container that populates or seeds my Mongo database container here. So for that purpose, I create a new directory called the db seed, and I've added a Docker file, and I specified the init.json, which is actually my data, which will be populated in that container. So Docker files here is spinning up. We're using Mongo image. I'm copying that init.json like the script of my actual product to that container, and then I'm running this command mongo import, which actually connect to existing database Mongo database container MongoDB, which is already exists in Docker compose file here. And then after that, I'm creating a database called the product store, and creating a collection of products and specifying the init.json file in order to populate my data. So in order to do that, I'm going back to my Docker compose file, and I have just to create another service. Let's call it db seed or mongo seed. So this is just another service, and we need to specify the image name. We can also call it mongo seed. We have to specify actually here like the directory where the Docker compose will look. So we will use build and specify that directory. It will look into DB seeds. So this is a folder, and that's it. Now, before going and building that application again, I have to turn down my whole application. So Docker Compose down will run. It will stop the UI, the products API, and all the running containers. If you go back here now, we don't see any containers running. So I have now my Mongo seed container in place. Once I build this, a MongoDB container will be running. The Mongo CD will connect to this MongoDB container, populate the actual data, and then the backend API can hit that database and actually retrieve that data. So let's now Docker Compose, specifying the name of my Docker Compose file, which is Docker Compose YAML, and up in order to build the application. So it's creating the network, going back and creating my images, and as you see here, it's up and running. If you see this step Mongo seed here, it's connected to my MongoDB and imported the actual C documents that I have in my init.json file. Everything seems good. Let's get back to my application here, get products, and my data are here and up, and my database is actually created with data. So this is what we want to go through for this session. In the next session, we will create our Azure Kubernetes service and container registry. So see you in the next session.